I'm Megan Dwyer and this is Richard Slaughter. It's the 23rd of February 2004 and I'm interviewing Richard as he's just published a new book and I am presenting on his topic, Creating Social Foresight. Thank you, Richard.
Pleasure.
Over the past few weeks I've been reading a lot of your writings and reading a lot about you. And what interests me is that after 20 years of working in the field, you've gone on this journey and this renewal of thinking continuously over more than 20 years. And your latest book now brings integral thinking into your concepts. So I suppose my real interest is what inspires you to continue renewing your thinking? What really sits at the core of you in terms of your motivation there?
Well, at the beginning, I guess at the heart of it, there is a great refusal. And the great refusal for me is that I just think it's so tragic that we should get so far in the evolution of consciousness and life on this planet that we should be living and operating in such a way that we put the whole enterprise at risk. So there is this sense of heading towards futures that simply don't make sense, at least to me. So that's one thing. The other part of the motivation, though, is aspiration. What do we want to achieve? So the longer I've been involved in the futures field, the more it's opened up and seemed to me to be a symbolic, practical and action space where you can actually not only talk about what needs to be done and how to do it, but you can actually start creating some of the systems that are needed to lead us away from overshoot and collapse toward the kind of futures that make more sense.
I suppose what I'm trying to really get at is very much at the core of you there is something that drives you towards this. There's something within you that is making you continually wanting to search out for that solution and to spread the message.
It's a passion. That's what Donald Campbell said. He said, follow your passion. My passion happens to be futures. It makes sense of an awful lot of things.
Can you sort of pinpoint critical incidents that led you to develop the passion?
Sure. When I was a teenager, I read a great deal of science fiction. And I just couldn't get for years and years why the future was populated by computers that went haywire, rampaging robots, alien invasions, the Earth catastrophes. Why on earth did the future have to be such a god-awful place? I just couldn't get it. And then in my mid-teens, I suddenly put two and two together and realized that what writers of science fiction were doing was taking trends that they saw in the world around them, maybe exaggerating them, maybe saying what if, and portraying futures that arose from that. When I had the chance to get to know some science fiction writers who had written dystopias, John Brunner would be a great example. He wrote 4. And I said, well, why do you just write utopias? Why do you just write dystopias? They're very, very useful. And I understand that it's not possible to write simple utopias anymore, but can't we do something more constructive? And one of the things that John said to me was, well, I've tried and it was too hard. So I struggled with that for some time, that writers of imaginative fiction couldn't themselves find the grounding in society around them to lead us to maybe portray images of more desirable futures. So that was one thing. Then late 60s, I came across a book while I was just finishing my teacher training called A Runaway World, ? And I read the book. It would be simplistic old hat now, but at the time there was nothing in my training as a teacher that in any way reflected what that book was about. The education system assumed a static, past-driven sort of thing, and the book portrayed a dynamic, evolving environment with real possibilities and real challenges. But the educational system didn't even see that, didn't acknowledge it, and still doesn't to a large extent. And then the final thing was when I went to live in Bermuda in 69 to 75. And there I was living in the middle of a small global experiment to see how the 20th century development pressures could be accommodated in 20 square miles of island. And frankly, they couldn't be. The place was being overrun by concrete, cars, growth. And I realized that what was very special and unique about the islands had already been lost by the time I went there. And that suggested to me that unless you pay very careful attention, you may just go down the stream of time and end up in a future that you didn't really want. So I came back to the UK Department of Independent Studies at University of Lancaster for the first time ever instead of having a curriculum laid on me from above, telling me what I was about, what I had to do, this was completely the other way around. This said, you know what you want to do, how can we help you? And that's where I picked up Futures.
But you obviously have an optimistic core.
Well, I think that's grounded in reality.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that the overshoot and collapse futures are necessary.
Mm-hmm.
I just believe that this progressive process of waking up, of becoming more aware, more foresightful, means that we can actually exert our autonomy towards ends that make sense. So there is I think one of the main outcomes of studying futures seriously, getting involved in them, is you can very quickly discern the grounds of informed optimism.
Mm-hmm. You talk about education, obviously that's been a strong focus of yours. I'm interested in the next generation, and perhaps you've got 2 children. What approach have you taken with them in terms of informing them about the civilisational challenge, and at what stages did you sort of pull them into this journey?
Well, in no sense consciously. I mean, I think you probably have to ask them exactly how they saw it. But if you're living a certain sort of life, I think it rubs off on your kids, and they either go with it or they rebel against it.
Mm-hmm.
It just so happens that my 2 boys really understood what I was doing and really find it very interesting or nourishing themselves.
But is it something that with other parents, there are some key things they could be doing to help their children come along?
Yes, absolutely. The best thing that parents can do, in my opinion, is to exert really strong grassroots pressure on education systems, not just at the school level, because they can't do much at that level, but to really get the bureaucratic systems to truly understand that the whole educational enterprise is, in its very essence, a futures-oriented enterprise. And to understand that very deeply is to help transform it, help it make it much more useful to young people than it currently is.
I want to ask you about, in one of your books you talk about there being 1,000 paths up a mountain.
Yes.
And you've chosen one path. How do you know that path's not a dead end? What is at the end of that path?
Well, I think the metaphor at the top of the mountain is obviously a metaphor.
Yeah.
And the end of the path is the same for all of us. It's really a question of having a terrific journey. So the point of the 1,000 paths is that what suits me in my path doesn't necessarily suit somebody else. The approach, the philosophy, the way of thinking that suits one person may be completely antithetical to someone else. So I've never believed in one true right way, but I believe that those of us who are engaged in authentic personal growth, whatever that means, find a path that moves them on to successive stages of capability and accomplishment. So what lies at the end of that, hopefully, is some sort of transcendence, some sort of way of resolving the issues of life that we all face.
And so has Wilber's integral theory been a key step on that path for you?
It wasn't the only step. There was a book by Aldous Huxley called The Perennial Philosophy, which I tripped over years ago, and I just thought that was amazing, because there was knowledge that was ancient in some respects, in many respects, but which informed our current predicament very deeply. So I could see that some of the solutions, or possible solutions to the future, weren't contemporary, weren't in the here and now, but actually may, in some senses, that the origins of them at least lie in the distant past. So I could see a whole set of possibilities arising there. And then I discovered Wilber, and his journey, his genius has been to distill a lot of what Huxley looked at and gave a kind of literary survey of into a structure, an interpretive structure that we can all use and learn from. So since then, Wilber's work has become central and very, very supportive in developing a sophisticated approach to futures.
Talking about the civilisational challenge, other writers that I read on this talk about a critical episode that will lead to an increased worldwide understanding of the problem, and then that will motivate people to action. Whereas your own layers approach that you outline in the new book seems to be somewhat in contrast to that, because it requires on multiple, quite complex,
Yes.
and actions will take a long time to,
Yes.
to actually address that challenge. Why do you think that the same people who are reading, or people who are reading the same signals, actually have sort of come up with the different approaches?
Well, that points us to the area of interpretation, which, interestingly enough, I covered in my own PhD, looking at the relevance of. People laughed and said, "What on earth has hermeneutics got to do with anything?" And hermeneutics is about meaning. It's about how you look at a text and interpret what it means, maybe decades or centuries after it was created. So I've lost the point. What was the question?
You're talking about how different people read the signals differently?
Oh, that's right. I was talking about the interpretive element. So my interpretation isn't necessarily going to be the same as yours, and yours isn't necessarily going to be the same as someone else's. I don't believe, for example, in a single transition, in a single learning experience. And if you look at Don Michael's work on learning to plan and planning to learn, about social learning, that's a very complex, very demanding area. It's quite obvious that there is no single event, no single trigger or insight that will get us there. So I came up with the idea of talking about a dialectic of foresight and experience. I very much regret that it seems to me that we are not going to move towards futures that make sense by just modelling and thinking and doing scenarios and doing what we do here, having foresight. Foresight seems to need to be augmented by experiences that demonstrate its validity. So the mad cow disease and the other problems with foot and mouth and so on in the UK reshaped those industries. They changed things. Years of warnings fell on deaf ears. So we seem to be caught up in that dialectic, and the issue is, how quickly can we learn, and can we learn the right lessons? But there is no single learning, there is no single lesson, there is no single way. It's a long process, and unfortunately it will take longer than many of us would wish.
Again, in the book you talk about the development of the futures field, and over the last 50 years you basically say that the field was born. So I'm wondering, with the next 50 years, what do you see happening with the field? And if you think of it in terms of the layers that you outlined.